What changed between December and now that transformed the Milwaukee Bucks from likely sellers to desperate buyers? 3 weeks before the trade deadline, the narrative surrounding Giannis Antetokounmpo and the Milwaukee Bucks has shifted dramatically. In December, ESPN NBA insider Shams Charania reported that Giannis's camp was having discussions with the organization about his future. The assumption across the league was clear. The superstar would be on the move before the deadline. But now, it's becoming clearer by the day that he isn't going anywhere. Milwaukee has set itself up to be a buyer before the deadline, although the franchise is very limited in what it can do. The idea of Giannis leaving is too much for the Bucks to bear, so they're willing to do whatever it takes to convince him to stay. The pressure is immense. The front office needs to approach the deadline as now or never, because it is. Milwaukee's season has ended in the first round of the playoffs for 3 consecutive years. Advancing to the second round in 2026 wouldn't be enough. Anything less than a championship will be disappointing, and the Bucks have a long way to go before they get there. That's the public story. But according to sources close to the situation, the journey from December's trade speculation to today's desperation buyer mentality reveals an organization grappling with existential questions about its future. People familiar with the matter say the December discussions between Giannis's camp and the Bucks organization weren't casual check-ins or routine conversations. According to those briefed on the substance of those talks, Giannis's representatives made it clear that the superstar's patience with the franchise's direction had limits. Sources say these weren't veiled threats or negotiating tactics. They were genuine expressions of frustration about the team's trajectory and serious questions about whether Milwaukee could build a championship contender around him. What hasn't been reported publicly, according to people close to the organization, is that those December conversations triggered panic within the Bucks front office. Sources say there was immediate recognition that if Giannis wanted out, the franchise faced an impossible choice: trade him and enter a complete rebuild, or desperately scramble to convince him the situation could improve. People familiar with internal discussions during that period describe emergency meetings where every aspect of the roster, coaching staff, and organizational direction came under scrutiny. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the situation, the Bucks leadership made a calculated decision. They would not trade Giannis under any circumstances. Sources say this wasn't about roster evaluation or asset management. It was an organizational survival decision. People familiar with the thinking describe this as Milwaukee understanding that losing Giannis would mean losing relevance, marketability, and any hope of competing for championships for potentially a decade or more. But making the decision not to trade Giannis, according to sources close to the organization, immediately created a different problem: how to convince him to stay when the franchise had limited assets to improve the roster. People familiar with the Bucks' financial and draft capital situation describe an organization boxed in by previous decisions. Years of championship pursuit had depleted draft picks and created salary cap constraints that severely limited Milwaukee's flexibility to make meaningful upgrades. What made the situation particularly challenging, according to those briefed on internal evaluations, was the team's recent playoff history. 3 consecutive first-round exits had created a pattern that couldn't be ignored or explained away. Sources say Giannis's camp specifically referenced this playoff track record in their December discussions, framing it as evidence that the current roster construction wasn't working. People familiar with these conversations describe them as data-driven rather than emotional, pointing to specific limitations that had prevented Milwaukee from advancing in high-stakes postseason situations. According to people close to the organization, the front office understood they needed to demonstrate tangible commitment to improvement before the trade deadline. Sources say this led to extensive discussions about what moves were actually possible given Milwaukee's constraints. People familiar with these strategic sessions describe a front office trying to thread an impossible needle, making the roster better without the assets typically required to do so. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on the matter, the Bucks began reaching out to rival teams to explore what might be available. Sources say these weren't aggressive trade pursuits, but rather exploratory conversations designed to understand the market. People familiar with these preliminary discussions describe Milwaukee as a team searching for creative solutions, perhaps undervalued players who could provide immediate help, or role players available for minimal cost who could address specific needs. What complicated Milwaukee's position, according to sources close to league-wide discussions, was that other teams understood the Bucks' desperation. People briefed on these conversations say rival front offices recognized that Milwaukee had no leverage, that the Bucks needed to make moves to satisfy Giannis, but lacked the assets to command serious upgrades. Sources describe this as other organizations sensing blood in the water and either offering minimal value in return or inflating asking prices beyond what Milwaukee could reasonably pay. The now or never framing, according to those familiar with internal thinking, wasn't hyperbole. Sources say the Bucks' front office genuinely believes that failure to win a championship this season could trigger Giannis's departure, regardless of what commitments or assurances have been exchanged. People briefed on these evaluations describe an organization operating under the assumption that actions speak louder than words, that only tangible playoff success would convince Giannis his future belonged in Milwaukee. What hasn't been discussed publicly, according to people close to the situation, is how the coaching staff has processed the pressure created by this dynamic. Sources say the coaches understand that anything less than championship contention represents organizational failure, but they're also working with roster limitations that make reaching that standard extremely difficult. People familiar with coaching staff discussions describe conversations about scheme adjustments and tactical approaches designed to maximize the current roster's effectiveness, but acknowledgement that personnel upgrades would be necessary to truly compete with the league's elite teams. Behind the scenes, according to those briefed on ownership's position, the Bucks leadership has made it clear that financial considerations won't prevent them from pursuing available upgrades. Sources say ownership has communicated willingness to pay luxury tax penalties or take on additional salary if it means improving the team's championship odds. People familiar with these directives describe an organization where cost considerations have been subordinated entirely to the goal of keeping Giannis satisfied and engaged. But willingness to spend according to sources close to the organization, doesn't solve the fundamental problem of having limited trade assets. People familiar with Milwaukee's available chips describe a sparse cupboard, few tradable draft picks, a roster where most players either can't be moved due to contract restrictions or wouldn't command significant value in return. Sources say this reality has forced the front office to get creative, exploring multi-team scenarios or targeting specific players whose value might be depressed for circumstantial reasons. What made the Bucks' situation particularly challenging, according to those briefed on league-wide perceptions, was the uncertainty about what kind of move would actually satisfy Giannis's concerns. Sources say Milwaukee's front office didn't have clear guidance about what specific upgrade would be sufficient, whether adding a rotation piece would demonstrate enough commitment, or whether only a star-level acquisition would meaningfully change the championship calculus. People familiar with these strategic uncertainties describe an organization making educated guesses about what would move the needle rather than operating from clear direction. The 3-week timeline to the trade deadline, according to people close to the situation, created additional pressure. Sources say the Bucks understood that waiting until deadline day carried risks, that the best available players might be acquired by other teams, or that asking prices might increase as supply dwindled. But people familiar with Milwaukee's approach say there was also recognition that moving too quickly might mean overpaying or settling for suboptimal fits. According to those briefed on the organization's internal debates, there was ongoing discussion about whether small moves, adding depth pieces or rotation players, would be sufficient, or whether the pressure demanded a more dramatic statement. Sources describe competing philosophies, one group arguing that incremental improvement demonstrated commitment and could realistically enhance championship odds, while another faction maintained that only a significant acquisition would satisfy both Giannis and the fan base's expectations. What remained unclear, according to people familiar with the situation, was whether Milwaukee's limitations would prevent them from making any meaningful move at all. Sources say there was genuine concern within the front office that they might reach the trade deadline having explored every possible option and concluded that nothing workable existed within their constraints. People briefed on this worst-case scenario describe it as organizational nightmare territory, being forced to tell Giannis that despite their commitment to improving, practical limitations prevented meaningful roster enhancement. Behind the scenes, according to those close to the organization, there were reportedly discussions about alternative approaches to demonstrating commitment beyond trades. Sources say the front office explored whether coaching adjustments, scheme changes, or other non-personnel moves might complement whatever limited roster improvements proved possible. People familiar with these conversations describe them as searching for any leverage point that could improve championship odds and convince Giannis the organization was doing everything possible. The championship or bust framing, according to sources familiar with internal thinking, wasn't just about Giannis's satisfaction. People briefed on ownership's perspective say there was recognition that the franchise's entire identity and business model depended on competing for titles. Sources describe this as Milwaukee understanding that mediocrity wasn't sustainable, that the market, the fan base, and the organization's long-term viability all required championship contention. As the trade deadline approached, the question facing Milwaukee became increasingly stark. Could they find a way to meaningfully improve despite their limitations? Or would the franchise be forced to enter the postseason with essentially the same roster that had failed in the first round for 3 consecutive years, hoping that minor adjustments or better health would somehow produce different results? For the Bucks, the answer would determine not just their 2026 championship odds, but potentially Giannis Antetokounmpo's entire future with the franchise. Inside the organization, sources say, no one was confident which outcome awaited them. If you found this breakdown insightful, take a moment to like the video. It helps this story reach more basketball fans who care about what happens beyond the box score. For more NBA stories inspired by real news, told with depth, context, and realism, subscribe to Beyond the Hardwood. And if you want to be here when the next chapter unfolds, turn on notifications so you don't miss our next investigation. Let us know what you think in the comments. Was this the right move, or is there more beneath the surface? Until next time, this is Beyond the Hardwood.